In The Long Goodbye by Raymond Chandler, his celebrated detective, Philip Marlowe, becomes involved in what appears to be two separate cases, but which wind up being connected. The first case is his growing friendship with Terry Lennox, who, it seems, is the murderer of his rich socialite wife. After the friendship ends with Marlowe driving Lennox to Mexico to escape a possible murder charge, the second storyline starts up. Marlowe is hired by Eileen Wade to find her husband, the famous novelist Roger Wade, who is a drunk and has either gone off on a bender or is drying out somewhere in a sanatorium. The two plot lines, Lennox and Wade, converge in more violence, in which Marlowe is implicated but doesn't participate. All of the classic hard-boiled elements are in place. A case that the detective doesn't actually want to take on, a beautiful woman, actually two as it transpires, the shift between high society and its opposite, and a variety of crimes and misdemeanours. And at the centre of it is the consciousness of Marlowe. What strikes you about Marlowe is his cynicism about the world and its inhabitants, and how this contrasts with his desire to find a modicum of decency in it. Los Angeles constantly lets him down in this regard. It's baffling to him how people who have fame, fortune and beauty, like the Wades, can still screw it up. He wants to believe that beautiful people, especially women, are good, but he is almost always disappointed. This struggle between the appearance of virtue and the reality of vice is shown in a number of inversions in the book. Eileen Wade herself, for example, is described several times as a dream and the golden girl, but she turns out to be perhaps the most wicked person in the story. Whereas a woman for whom Marlowe had very little time, Linda Loring, turns out to be nowhere near as malevolent as he thought her to be. In minor examples of this same incongruence, there is a Mexican servant who takes against Marlowe and seems to be implicated in at least one of the deaths, but who in the end decides that Marlowe is a good guy and is himself vindicated. And a black chauffeur who, despite his lowly station, is university educated and quotes T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land at Marlowe. This reversal of expectations is epitomised both symbolically and physically in the fate of Terry Lennox, who has apparently disappeared committing suicide near the beginning of the book, but reappears in drastically altered form at its conclusion. The discrepancy between what he expects and what he finds drives Marlowe's attitude, which is given form in Chandler's style and his famous use of metaphors and similes. In Farewell, My Lovely, there is a famous description of the big lunk, Moose Malloy, looking as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food, and here there are similar examples. I belonged in Idle Valley like a pearl onion on a banana split. Speaking of a paper napkin, Marlowe says, it looked as cheesy as a celluloid collar. I drove back to Hollywood feeling like a short length of chewed string. Inside my head, thoughts stuck together like flies on flypaper. Marlowe is angry at the world for not living up to his expectations, and this shows in his violent yoking together of disparate images, another kind of inversion, and in his aggression towards almost anyone he meets, even clients. But what riles him most are blondes. There are blondes and blondes, and it is almost a joke word nowadays. All blondes have their points, except perhaps the metallic ones who are as blonde as a Zulu under the bleach, and as to disposition as soft as a sidewalk. There is the small cute blonde who cheeps and twitters, and the big statuesque blonde who straight-arms you with an ice-blue glare. There is the blonde who gives you the up-from-under look and smells lovely and shimmers and hangs on your arm and is always very, very tired when you take her home. She makes that helpless gesture and has that goddamned headache, and you would like to slug her, except that you are glad you found out about the headache before you invested too much time and money and hope in her. And so on, for almost 2 pages. You begin to think that Marlowe, or Chandler, had had a really bad experience with a blonde woman. And true enough, at the end of the book, Marlowe has a brief liaison with Linda Loring, who is dark-haired. So Marlowe is angry, distrustful, cynical, and dislikes modern life. There are several Marlovian rants against television shows and televised boxing, for example, an interesting view of how the changing media landscape was impacting on writers. He does a bit of sleuthing, partly by paying another agency to do it for him, and partly by driving around and talking to people. But just as often, events happen to him. Characters are introduced who are vibrantly interesting for a chapter, for example Dr. Veringer and his pupil/patient Earl, but who then disappear from the story as if Chandler could find no further use for them. And, as seems often the case in Chandler's work, the story never knows when to end. There are at least 3 false endings to the book before the final one, involving Terry Lennox, puts a stop to the whole thing. So what can a modern crime writer learn from this alleged founder of the modern detective novel? Primarily, we can see the importance of character in driving interest in the story. The whys and wherefores of the murders in the book are almost incidental. Who cares why the murderer did what he or she did? Motive is secondary to the display of garish lives that are meaningless and perhaps worthless. Chandler is not interested in the typical detective story trope of creating a puzzle for us to unravel. In fact, in a famous article, Chandler overtly criticized this tendency in his contemporaries. His interests are different. He once described Los Angeles as having the personality of a paper cup, and in his books he seems to extend this perception to the city's inhabitants, where personality is redefined as character in the old-fashioned sense, the ability to act with integrity and honour. The depiction of the book's characters in their anomie and reckless hedonism, and sometimes greed and degeneracy, shows us a world in which morality has been turned upside down. Ross MacDonald's Lou Archer books show us the dark side of the American family. Chandler shows us that people can be interesting and have personality, but still be devoid of moral strength and purpose. For modern writers of crime novels, the lesson is perhaps that people will read your books if your hero is aware of the moral turpitude that surrounds him or her, while continuing to assert that decency and integrity are possible. This isn't an exhortation to make your central character a prig, but to have him or her demonstrate that there are certain lines that can't be crossed if society as a moral force is to be maintained. If, as a writer, you can do this with humour and a spring in your prose, then readers may well be seduced into entering your fictional world. Thanks for watching. There'll be new videos every Monday. It would be great if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell to learn when new videos are online, and hit like if you enjoyed it. Thanks again.